Robert Higgs is Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. He's the author of several books, and I can tell you this, that if you read Higgs's books, you will have a deeper understanding of the national security state and the problem that we face in this country than probably 99% of the political science professors in this country. His books are absolutely awesome. They include Delusions of Power, Depression, War, and Cold War, Neither Liberty Nor Safety, Resurgence of the Warfare State, Against Leviathan, and the real classic, every libertarian's favorite, if you get just one book, get Crisis in Leviathan, which is an absolutely phenomenal book explaining how government uses crises to expand its power. He received his PhD degree at Johns Hopkins University, and Bob has taught at the University of Washington, Lafayette College, Seattle University, University of Economics at Prague, and was a visiting scholar at Oxford and at Stanford. And, as I discovered libertarianism, as I've made my way in the libertarian movement, I've had my personal heroes in the movement, Ludwig von Mises, Bastiat, Hazlitt, but one of my real-life living heroes is Bob Higgs. I mean, this man has inspired me. He's about as pure a libertarian as you'd ever find, and it's a big honor to present to you Bob Higgs.
Well, I share 3 out of 4 of Bumper's heroes. Thank you all for braving the elements to be here today. It's great to see some old friends out there in the audience, and if you're not an old friend, perhaps you will become a friend today. We don't have a lot of time, and I'm told that I'll be dragged away if I take too long, so I'm going to get started straight away. The conference, at least the Future Freedom Foundation, part of it has to do with the national security state, and my talk right now also has to do with that in part, but it also deals with the state in general. I don't think one can really divorce the two. You can't understand the national security state if you don't understand the state, period. And that's a mistake that I think a lot of so-called national security experts make. But however that may be, that's going to be the nature of what I have to say to you. Margaret Atwood's poem, Siren Song, begins, "This is the one song everyone would like to learn. The song that is irresistible, the song that forces men to leap overboard in squadrons, even though they see the beached skulls." Our rulers know how to sing that song, and they sing it day and night. The beached skulls are those of our fathers and our sons, friends, neighbors, for whom the song proved not only irresistible, but fatal. The state is the most destructive institution human beings have ever devised. A fire that at best can be controlled for only a short time before it o'erleaps its improvised confinements and spreads its flames far and wide. Whatever promotes the growth of the state also weakens the capacity of individuals in civil society to fend off the state's depredations, and therefore augments the public's multifaceted victimization at the hands of state functionaries. Nothing promotes the growth of the state as much as national emergency, war especially, but also other crises comparable to war in the seriousness of the threats they appear to pose. States, by their very nature, are perpetually at war. Not always against foreign foes, of course, but always against their own subjects. The state's most fundamental purpose, The activity without which it cannot even exist is plunder. The state gains its very sustenance, mainly from extortion, which it pretties up ideologically by giving it a different name, taxation, and by striving to sanctify its intrinsic crimes as permissible and socially necessary. State propaganda, statist ideologies, and long-established routine combine to convince many people that they have a legitimate obligation, even a moral duty, to pay taxes to the state that rules their society. They fall into such erroneous moral reasoning because they are told incessantly that the tribute they fork over is actually a kind of price paid for essential services received, and that in the case of certain services, such as the protection from foreign and domestic aggressors, only the government can provide the service effectively. They are not permitted to test this claim by resorting to competing suppliers of law, order, and security, however, because the government enforces a monopoly over the production and distribution of its alleged services and brings violence to bear against would-be competitors. In so doing, it reveals the fraud at the heart of its impudent claims and gives sufficient proof that it is not a genuine protector, but a mere protection racket. All governments are, as they must be, oligarchies. Only a relatively small number of people have substantial effective discretion to make critical decisions about how the state's power will be brought to bear. Beyond the oligarchy itself and the police and military forces that compose its Praetorian Guard, somewhat larger groups constitute a supporting coalition. These groups provide important financial and other support to the oligarchs and look to them for compensating rewards. Legal privileges, subsidies, jobs, exclusive franchises and licenses, transfers of financial income and wealth, goods and services in kind, and other booty channeled to them at the expense of the mass of the people. Thus, the political class in general, that is, the oligarchs, the Praetorian Guards, and the supporting coalition, uses government power, which means ultimately the police and the armed forces, to exploit everyone outside this class by wielding or threatening to wield violence against all who fail to pay the tribute the oligarchs demand and to obey the rules they dictate. Democratic political forms and rituals, such as elections and formal administrative proceedings, disguise this class exploitation and trick the masses into the false belief that the government's operation yields them net benefits. In the most extreme form of misapprehension, the people at large become convinced that owing to democracy, they themselves are the government. Individual passages back and forth across the boundary between the political class and the exploited class testify, however, to nothing more than the system's cunningly contrived flexibility and openness. Although the system is inherently exploitative and cannot exist in any other form, it allows some leeway at the margins in the determination of which specific individuals will be the perpetrators and which the victims. At the top, a modest degree of circulation of elites within the oligarchy also serves to mask the political system's essential character. It is a sound interpretive rule, however, that anything that cannot be accomplished except with the aid of threats or the actual exercise of violence against unoffending persons cannot be beneficial to one and all. The mass belief in the general beneficence of democracy represents a kind of Stockholm syndrome writ large. Yet, no matter how widely this syndrome may extend, it cannot alter the basic fact that owing to the operation of government as we know it, that is, government without voluntary, express, individual consent, a minority lives on balance at the expense of the rest, and the rest therefore lose on balance in the process, while the oligarchs, elected or not, it scarcely matters, preside over the enormous web of criminal organizations we know as the state. Notwithstanding the ideological enchantment with which official high priests and statist intellectuals have beguiled the plundered class, many members of this class retain a capacity to recognize at least some of their losses, and hence they sometimes resist further incursions on their rights by publicly expressing their grievances, by supporting political challengers who promise to lighten their burdens, by fleeing the country, and perhaps most important, by evading or avoiding taxes and by violating legal prohibitions and regulatory restraints on their actions, as in the so-called underground economy or black market. These various forms of resistance together compose a force that opposes the government's constant pressure to expand its domination. These two forces, working one against the other, establish a locus of rough equilibrium, a boundary between the set of rights the government has overridden or seized and the set of rights the plundered class has somehow managed to retain, whether by formal constitutional constraints or by everyday tax evasion, black market transactions, and other defensive violations of the government's oppressive rules. Politics in the largest sense can be viewed as the struggle to push this boundary one way or the other. For members of the political class, the crucial question is always, how can we push out the frontier? How can we augment the government's domination and plunder with net gain to ourselves, the exploiters who live not by honest production and voluntary exchange, but by fleecing those who do? National emergency, war, or a similarly menacing crisis answers the political class's crucial question more effectively than anything else, because such a crisis has the uniquely effective capacity to dissipate the forces that otherwise would obstruct or oppose the government's expansion. Virtually any war will serve, at least for a while, because in modern nation states, the outbreak of war invariably leads the masses to rally round the flag, regardless of their previous ideological stance in relation to the government. Recall the situation in 1941, for example, when public opinion polls and other evidence indicated that a great majority of the American people, at least 80% as late as the autumn of 1941, opposed outright engagement in the World War, an engagement that Franklin Roosevelt and his administration had been seeking relentlessly by hook and by crook from the beginning. When news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor reached the public, mass opposition to war dissolved overnight, almost completely. No wonder the neocon intriguers, in a September 2000 report of the Project for the New American Century, expressed their yearning for, quote, some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor, end quote. In 2001, the attacks of 9/11 answered to perfection the neocon prayer for a new Pearl Harbor. An administration that had been wallowing without a breeze in its sails was suddenly invested with overwhelming public support for aggressive military action abroad. Public opinion polls showed huge jumps in President Bush's popularity. Although Bush had done absolutely nothing to demonstrate an abruptly improved performance of his job as president, nearly the entire population, many members of which roundly disliked the president, suddenly showered approbation on his performance in office. When the public's approval of the president's action is broken down by specific issues, we see that his greatest 9/11 related jump occurred in the area of, amazingly enough, foreign affairs. The lesson is clear, and I could walk you through any number of similar lessons from other episodes in our history. The lesson is clear. If the president conducts foreign policy so as to antagonize foreigners and provoke them to launch massively destructive attacks on this country, the American public will respond with an enormous outpouring of approval of his actions, as if to prove that in our political system, no failure goes unrewarded. Bertrand Russell long ago stated the underlying condition for this sort of perverse public reaction when he remarked that, quote, "Neither a man nor a crowd nor a nation can be trusted to act humanely or to think sanely under the influence of a great fear," end quote. Indeed, the fundamental condition of the entire process by which the government leads people to their own destruction is widespread public fear, which causes people to put aside their normal distrust of the state and to turn to it, especially to its chief, as a child turns to a parent for security and reassurance that everything will be okay if only people do as they are told. Moreover, not only did the events of September 11, 2001 cause the American public to look more favorably on the president as a person, as a president, and as the principal architect of U.S. foreign policy, but those events also apparently caused the public to express more trust in the federal government in general, in its handling of both international and domestic matters. Polls indicated a complete turnaround toward greater trust than distrust of government. In searching for the cause of this tremendous, rationally unjustified rallying around the flag, we don't have far to go. Such public reactions are always driven by a combination of fear, ignorance, and uncertainty against a background of intense jingoistic nationalism, a popular culture predisposed toward violence, and a general inability to distinguish between the state and the people at large. Because the government ceaselessly sings the siren song, relentlessly propagandizing the public to look upon it as their protector, such alleged protection being the principal excuse for its routinely plundering them and violating their natural rights, and because the mass media incessantly magnify and spread the government's propaganda, we can scarcely be surprised if that propaganda turns out to have entered deeply into many people's thinking, especially when they are in a state of near panic. Unable to think clearly in an informed way, most people fall back on a childlike us against them style of understanding the perceived threat and what should be done about it. Thus, an initial incident, even one the government itself has provoked or trumped up, invariably causes the masses to rally around the flag. The ardent enthusiasm and mindless support for the government's war-making does begin to erode soon afterward, however, when the people increasingly come to their senses, as casualties and other costs accumulate, and as bits and pieces of the truth seep out. Why does the system not revert to the status quo ante bellum? The answer is that actions taken during the early days of the crisis, when the government responds practically without opposition to the public's fear and desire for retribution by vastly expanding its powers, take the form of political, legal, and institutional changes that set precedents or become so deeply embedded that not all of them are abandoned during the post-crisis stage of incomplete retrenchment. For example, soon after the Pearl Harbor attack, the government enacted the first War Powers Act, December 18, 1941, and the second War Powers Act the following March. These sweeping delegations empowered the president to rearrange the executive branch as he pleased, gave him a free hand to contract with munitions suppliers almost as he pleased, gave him far-reaching control over international financial transactions and censorship power over all communications between the United States and any foreign country. They expanded the government's powers to seize private property for war purposes, empowered the president to set priorities for deliveries of designated goods and services, and gave the president effectively unrestrained power over resource allocation in the domestic economy, a power he delegated to the War Production Board under his direct oversight. Wielding all this authority, the president and his lieutenants became, in effect, central planners of a command economy for the duration of the war. Similarly, just 6 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, the government enacted the USA Patriot Act, which greatly trenched on civil liberties and long-established rights, effectively demolished the Fourth Amendment, and gave a mighty boost to the U.S. police state. Other measures moving in the same direction followed soon afterward, including nationalization of the airline security industry and creation of the bureaucratic monstrosity known as the Department of Homeland Security, an organization as menacing in its ideological underpinnings as it is feckless, insulting, and absurd in its day-to-day operations. Moreover, as we have learned recently, the government unleashed the NSA to collect information on everybody's communications in every electronic form, making itself a seeing eye into everyone's personal affairs and making an absolute mockery of anyone's right to privacy. Once the government has expanded greatly at the outset of a war or other crisis and then employed its powers for an extended period, getting rid of all these weapons in the government's arsenal of power is virtually impossible, even when the emergency ends and people clamor for a return to normal arrangements. Therefore, many of the crisis measures become permanent parts of the government's apparatus for dominating and plundering those outside the political class. Wartime organizations may be retained to carry on new functions. Cases such as that of the War Finance Corporation, created in 1918, and its direct descendants exemplify how national emergency solidifies so-called iron triangles, alliances of government bureaucrats, congressional overseers, and privileged private sector beneficiaries. These arrangements are called iron because they're so difficult to break. Their beneficiaries have great incentive to fight for the retention and even for the expansion of the triangle's activities, whereas the general public rarely has much incentive to fight against them, even when it is aware of them, because the public burden per capita is normally too small to justify anyone's expenditure of much time or effort in the requisite politicking. Under modern conditions, high wartime taxes always stick to some extent, leaving the amount of the government's plunder much greater after the war than it was before the war. In the present so-called war on terror, the government has partially concealed this increased seizure of private property by running up the national debt rather than by jacking up ordinary tax rates or imposing new kinds of taxes. But this financial trick does not alter the raw fact that the government has been using more of the people's resources for its own purposes, as shown by the rapid run-up of its spending. leaving the public on the hook to pay for the increased interest and eventually to repay the principal, or to suffer the consequences if the government should attempt, in effect, to repudiate its obligations to creditors by inflating the money stock. During the Bush administration, Treasury debt held by the public grew from $3.3 trillion at the end of fiscal 2001 to $7.6 trillion at the end of fiscal 2009. Okay? 3.3 to 7.6 under Bush, and the Obama administration has presided over a further increase to 9.9 trillion by the end of fiscal 13, which means by now it's way over $10 trillion of debt held by the public. This doesn't take into account the accounting tricks such as the Social Security Administration's holding bonds of the U.S. government. Apart from the financial legacies that exacerbate the government's burden on the public, national emergencies leave institutional legacies of various kinds that enhance government power at the expense of people's liberties. The rent controls of World War II, for example, never ended in New York City. For more than 70 years, they have denied landlords and tenants the liberty to contract on any mutually agreeable terms, and they have created incentives that foster the avoidance of maintenance for rented apartments and discourage the construction of new structures that would be built if only the housing market were free of these war-born fetters. The institutional legacies of the New Deal, of course, are legion even now, nearly 80 years after Roosevelt's political momentum petered out. We have a vast system of agribusiness subsidies, intricate regulations of financial markets, union management relations and financial intermediaries, federal insurance of bank deposits, home mortgages, and other financial liabilities, direct federal involvement in electricity production and distribution. The list goes on and on. All legacies of so-called emergency actions taken during the New Deal. Perhaps more important, crisis has effects on the dominant ideology that work in favor of long-lasting government power and the permanent reduction of public liberties. During wartime or other crises, governments take many actions that would be more or less unthinkable in a reasonably free society during normal times, because people would not tolerate them. Having tolerated them during a national emergency, however, people may come to regard them not only as permanently tolerable, but even as desirable. For example, nearly everything the U.S. government did during the Great Depression had an obvious wartime precedent during the Great War, 1914-18. President Herbert Hoover declared, quote, "We used such emergency powers to win the war. We can use them to fight the Depression," end quote. And they did, on a mass scale. Everything from the Depression-era agricultural price controls to the industrial cartelization program, the public housing program, the schemes to control oil and coal prices, the tax hikes, and the promotion of labor unionization had a precedent in 1917-18. Obviously, many of these war-inspired public policies then became permanent after the 1930s, as did later the military-industrial complex created between 1940 and 1945. People can get used to almost anything, especially if it has a plausible justification. War and other great crises managed by the government soften up formerly free people and habituate them to government controls and abuses they would resist, except for their alleged emergency necessity. In this way, government emergency measures change the very character of once free people by breaking down their will to be free and their determination to resist homegrown tyranny. It is important to appreciate that all the effects on freedom that I have been discussing occur regardless of the rationale for the war or other crisis intervention itself. You may love all those wars. You may love the New Deal, but you're going to pay a price for it of the sort I've been describing. One may regard a war as ever so necessary and desirable, or not. Yet these effects will occur in either case. The logic of a government at war asserts itself in more or less the same fashion, regardless of the war's provocation and purpose, because every major war requires the government to take a much bigger bite out of the people's resources quickly, and it cannot do so successfully without suppressing many normal liberties and rights, especially those that might be exercised to obstruct the government's wartime programs and policies, or to persuade people to resist the war or to demand its discontinuation or settlement. The government and its supporters vigorously denounce all those who stand in the way as traitors, and the state encourages the masses to act as amateur G-men, identifying disloyal citizens, hounding them into buckling under, and reporting them to government authorities. Great peacetime initiatives operate similarly. Many historians have noted the parallels between the government's intimidating public efforts to entice or browbeat people into cooperation with the National Recovery Administration and the Nazi extravaganzas being staged in Germany at the same time. There's even an interesting book called Three New Deals, which is about Mussolini's, Hitler's, and Roosevelt's. I recommend it. Nowadays, for example, the government frequently encourages all of us to report any suspicious persons or actions to the police or the FBI, ostensibly to prevent terrorism. Needless to say, no free society can exist when everyone, in effect, has enlisted as a government informant, especially when the character of the threatening persons and actions is so vague that it is bound to give rise to abuses. Not uncommonly now, people are reported for nothing more than looking like an Arab, or for speaking a strange language to strange-looking companions. This insidious enlistment of informants, so reminiscent of the atrocious American Protective League during World War I, is turning our once open society into a sort of East Germany redux. Horror stories abound of perfectly innocent persons taken into custody for interrogation or worse. While the government promotes mindless support of its war-making and may induce a sort of patriotic hysteria in the most mentally fragile personalities, many citizens swing into action as faux patriots on strictly opportunistic grounds. War contractors, for example, may be able to position themselves to make a killing, so to speak, off of the actual killing. Moreover, they may parlay their wartime business as government suppliers into profitable post-war business that long outlives the war itself. The aircraft companies that suddenly profited so greatly during World War II, for example, became permanent, highly successful feeders at the government's trough, where some of them are feasting lavishly even now. The current administration's military buildup having proved a godsend for them and a boon to their stockholders. Other people simply want a cushy job in the government's expanded wartime bureaucracy. When you think about the government's employment, don't just think of the people on the official payroll. Think of all those people out there to the north and west and south of us right now who purport to be private corporations, but who rely entirely or in very large part on taxpayer money to pay themselves and their shareholders. This town is practically paved with such parasites. The so-called war on terror has given rise to a huge industry that has emerged almost from scratch during the past few years. According to a 2006 Forbes report, The Department of Homeland Security and its predecessor agencies paid private contractors at least $130 billion after 9/11. That was up to 2006. Paid Homeland Security contractors $130 billion, and other federal agencies spent a comparable amount. Thus, besides the military-industrial congressional complex, or the MIC, we now have a parallel security-industrial congressional complex, or SIC. Between 1999 and 2006, the number of federal Homeland Security contractors increased from 9 companies, okay, in 1999, 9 companies. In 2006, 33,890 contracting companies. Think about that. And a multi-billion-dollar industry arose selling security-related goods and services, complete with a specialized array of newsletters, magazines, websites, consultants, trade shows, job placement services, and a veritable army of lobbyists working around the clock to widen the river of money that flows to these opportunists. As Paul Harris wrote, quote, "America is in the grip of a business based on fear," end quote. The last thing these vultures want, of course, is an abatement of the perceived terrorist threat. And we can count on them to hype any signs of an increase in such threats and, of course, to crowd the trough, happily slurping the taxpayers' money. What chance does peace have? What chance does peace have when millions of well-heeled, politically connected opportunists of all stripes depend on the continuation of a state of war for their personal financial success? For members of Congress, the Department of Homeland Security quickly became the most magnificent dispenser of pork and patronage to come along in decades. Everyone is happy here, except for the beleaguered ordinary citizens whose pockets are being picked and whose liberties are being overridden by politicians and private sector predators with utter contempt for the people's intelligence and rights. Yet, so long as the people continue to be consumed by fear and to fall for the age-old swindle that the government seeks only to protect them, these abuses will never end. Recall Margaret Atwood's poem, Siren Song, that I read from at the start of my talk. This is the one song everyone would like to learn, the song that is irresistible, the song that forces men to leap overboard in squadrons, even though they see the beached skulls. And that poem ends, "Alas, it is a boring song, but it works every time." In the present regard, it works every time because the people falsely believe that those who sing it are their protectors rather than their exploiters. Until people learn to disregard the state's siren song of beneficence and protection, they will continue to suffer and die as victims of the state's wars, foreign and domestic. People yearn for security, and they look to the state to provide it. But they are calling on a wolf to guard the sheep. The state cannot refrain from crime because it is an inherently criminal enterprise, living by plunder and extortion and retaining its turf by murder, and if need be, by mass murder. Constantly singing the siren song, it seduces the people by giving back to them a portion of what it has previously extorted from them, and by ceaselessly claiming to protect them from all manner of threats to their lives, liberties, property, and even their self-esteem. If it protects them at all, however, it does so only as a shepherd protects his captive flock. Not because he recognizes and respects the natural rights of the sheep, but only to keep them unmolested in his sole possession and control until he finds it expedient to shear or slaughter them. A peaceful state is an impossibility. Even a state that refrains from fighting foreigners goes on fighting its own subjects continuously to keep them under its control and to suppress competitors who might try to break into the domain of its protection racket. The people cry out for security, yet they will not take responsibility for their own protection, and like the mariners of Greek mythology, they leap overboard immediately in response to the siren song. Thank you very much. We now have time for some
5 minutes. We have 5 minutes.
questions, comments. Anyone like to stand up and throw rotten fruit at me? Come to the microphone, please.
Hi. This might be an elementary question, but the second question I'm always asked by friends when we're talking is, if libertarianism is so great, why are there no libertarian societies? So do you think today's talk effectively answers that question? And if you were posed that, how would you answer it? Thank you.
Well, I think it goes some distance toward answering that question. We didn't get the world we live in from nothing. It's a result of thousands of years of development of human social practices, political practices, belief systems development, and a lot of other things, including all the specific kinds of events that litter history at every time. So if somebody says, if libertarianism were so great, it would already exist, you could have said the same thing not so long ago in history. If freedom is so great, why does everybody have slavery? It's existed for thousands of years. It existed everywhere, all over the world, and people could give you any number of reasons. Even well-educated people just across the river here in D.C., or in D.C. for that matter, they had slaves here too. They could have given you a litany of reasons why slavery was necessary and good and had to be preserved forever. And what madmen the abolitionists were to want to abolish slavery. Now we libertarians are the madmen. They say, you're mad. You think you can have a society without its domination by murderous exploiters? And I think, yes, we can. At least we could give it a hell of a try. What we've got isn't doing so great. So there's a long answer and a short answer to that kind of question. And I guess in a way what I've been writing about for the last 45 or 50 years is a long answer. And then there's the short answer, which is, it's as good as abolishing slavery. In fact, it's very similar in many regards. Yes, sir.
Thank you for speaking. That was all terribly interesting. And I'm new to all this, so I'm kind of sinking it in. But you mentioned that the state cannot exist without war, correct? Am I quoting you correctly on that? So in that regard, is it possible to achieve, you said it's not possible, is it possible to achieve a state of non-war, or if we can't do that, do we need to get rid of the state to do that?
Well, the state is intrinsically war-making. Since it lives by plunder, the only way it can make people submit to that plunder is by a combination of threatening them with violence and propagandizing them with the help of lots of people who don't necessarily work for the state, like your professors at the university you may attend, with the aid of what used to be called the combination of throne and altar. See, the throne wielded the sword and said, I'll cut your head off if you don't pay tribute. And the priests in the old days said, you know, do what the king tells you because he's blessed by God and he's here for a perfectly heavenly reason. And in some societies they even said he is a god. The pharaohs were gods, the Roman emperors were gods, and it goes on and on. Yeah, just imagine Barack Obama's a god. Well, that's more than I can swallow, but I'm sure there are people out there who would gulp it right down. But anyhow, you get this combination of jiving people and threatening them with violence, and it takes you a long way. Now, it doesn't succeed every time. There are governments that have been overthrown throughout history. So it's kind of a balancing act. Governments can overplay their hand. They can use too much force and get people up in arms, thinking they have nothing more to lose. Or they can just lose their hold ideologically, and people will come to see through them and say, this is baloney. You know, what you're doing to justify these crimes doesn't float, and we're not going to accept that anymore as a reason for your actions. So there are many ways in which governments can be overthrown. The trouble historically is when they've been overthrown, they've been replaced by other governments because people thought, oh, the problem was that was a bad government. And the trouble was not that. It was a state, and all states are bad. Okay? And the only way to permanently get rid of this, if there is a way to permanently get rid of it, is to permanently get rid of the damn state.